Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Kate McKenzie. I am a PhD researcher here at SCELG and a legal analyst at C2LI, which you will hear a bit more about later. Francesco will expand on this in his remarks, but the webinar today is more than just a book launch. It will also serve to introduce an initiative that stems from the book itself. I was very fortunate to have the opportunity not only to contribute to the book, but also to work with the two editors and also with our 42 authors throughout the publishing process. And I have been privileged to be involved with C2LI from the beginning. So it is a great pleasure to chair today's webinar and book launch. Some housekeeping up front. We will use both the chat and the Q&A functions today. Please use the chat function to introduce yourself and your interest in or work on climate litigation. Please also use the chat if you would like to get in touch with C2LI following today's webinar to discuss possible areas of collaboration. If you have questions, please use the Q&A function and not the chat, and I will do my best to get to as many questions as possible for Francesco to address after his presentation. Finally, as a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on both the SCELG and C2LI websites and YouTube channels. Now, the book that will be presented today is, I have it right here, it's beautiful, Comparative Climate Change Litigation Beyond the Usual Suspects. It was published by Springer in January of this year. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Springer for supporting this webinar. And also, Springer has provided us with a discount code for webinar participants of 20% off the printed book or the ebook. And I will pop that in the chat so you can all take advantage of that as well. Without further ado, I will give the floor to Francesco, who will be, he'll begin with a presentation, and then we will have time for a discussion with the attendees. Francesco, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kate. I will be sharing some slides in just a second, but just wanted to thank you, Kate, for chairing this webinar, Springer for supporting it, and also the law school and my colleague Mara for also co-organizing and co-hosting it. It's been a long journey. It's taken quite some time to get this book out. It started in a way back in 2017. I'll say a bit more about that. So obviously in an hour, even less that I want to present, I cannot say everything about it. But I do want to say that this was one of the most exciting and one of the most rewarding professional journeys that I have ever undertaken. And I hope I can share some of it with all of you here. And I really would like to know who you are. I would like you to mingle. Now, the chat is not as nice as a coffee or a pub after the webinar, but that's what we have. So I do encourage you to use the chat to introduce yourselves, to tell us a little bit about what your interests are in climate litigation. And throughout the presentation, I will give you some hints as to when you can pop your interest in collaborating or just getting more information about the book and C2LI. So please do use the chat if you want to. And I will now share my slides. So maybe not all of you have seen this film, but I remember when it came out, I thoroughly enjoyed The Usual Suspects. And when I was thinking with the other co-editor, Makanmo's Menge, about a title for this book, that was, again, back in 2018-19, I thought this would be really appropriate, Beyond the Usual Suspects. Because, and here I anticipate very much, one, if not the most important message of the book and of C2LI, is that climate litigation is happening everywhere, or there is the potential for it to happen everywhere, not just in those countries that could be considered the usual suspects. So both the book and the policy relevant tool that stems from it really has this aspect to it. It's beyond the usual suspect. It's beyond also just English, as I will explain later. So what is it that I want to achieve with this short presentation? I want to explain the process behind how a book becomes actually something else. And in doing so, I want to introduce the Climate Change Litigation Initiative. Now, the four things I will touch upon will be obviously what we are dealing with here is climate change. So we'll mention a little bit about climate change. I will highlight how domestic litigation can play a role in fighting climate change. I will then say a few words about the book itself, Beyond the Usual Suspects, and I will finish by introducing C2LI, the policy relevant tool that stems from the book itself. Now let's start with climate change. Now there's a very important number when we think about climate change, and that is 1.5. The 1.5 degrees is the key goal that we all have to achieve, 1.5 degrees average increase from pre-industrial levels. And that is what is going to keep us safe. Now, the problem is that the other numbers do not really work. So the reductions needed by 2030 compared to 2010 levels are 45%. But actually, even if the reductions in the pledges, according to the Paris Agreement, were to be met by 2030, we would only be reducing 1%. So we're definitely not on the right track. This also tells you the same story. The temperature goal by 2050, that is the 1.5 degrees goal. If the pledges are met, so if the countries actually do what they have promised to do, we would have a 2.5 degrees increase. Not good enough. It gets even worse if the temperature increases with business as usual, meaning the countries actually follow what they have done until now. That would be a 2.9, almost 3% degrees increase, with all the negative effects that that entails, which I will not go into here. So climate change is a huge issue, and we're not going in the right direction. Now, what does litigation have to do with all of this? And in particular, what does domestic litigation have to do with all of this? To better understand this, we have to go back to the Paris Agreement, 2015, all the hands in the air, everybody cheering. And the Paris Agreement obliges countries, in Article 4.2, to prepare, submit, and maintain nationally determined contributions, NDCs. Now, in doing that, domestic mitigation measures shall be put in place. This could be a piece of law, this could be policy. But what are the nature of these measures? Well, these measures shall be put in place with the aim of achieving the objectives of such contributions, the NDCs. So there could be a scenario where a country, yes, does put in place a measure, but actually they allegedly do not achieve the objectives put forward in the NDC. Civil society, individuals consider that what the country has put in place does not achieve that objective. And that's where, because this is national law and national policy within a domestic judicial setting, there could be domestic litigation. And we both in the book and in C2LI have considered this first scenario, scenario 1, which we call public climate policy litigation, which very much focuses on NDC implementation. But this is not the only scenario. There could be a second scenario, which is a country or government department authorizes a project that contributes negatively to climate change. It could be the expansion of an airport. It could be the authorization of oil exploration in the sea. Again, individuals, civil society may be against such decisions and recur to domestic litigation. A third scenario, which we call private climate litigation, is or could happen when private sector undertakes activities that contribute negatively to climate change. This could be the operations of the oil and gas sector. But, and very importantly, in my opinion, could also be operations of, for example, companies involved in pension funds or equity and so forth. So, the overall goal is 1.5 degrees. There's not just one way of getting there. There's a lot of areas and actors and stakeholders. Clearly, the international climate negotiations are important, and they have allowed us to have the Paris Agreement. Civil society has shown incredible resilience and incredible strength, not just with the climate strikes movement, but all over the place. And the private sector has a role to play, in reducing its carbon footprint. Now, civil society has a role and a voice, both in the international climate negotiations, and to some extent, even with the private sector. At the end of the day, civil society is the consumers. We are the consumers, if you want, of what the private sector does. But civil society can be frustrated or can feel that not enough is being done, both at the international climate negotiations or by the private sector, and can hence bypass this involvement, if you want, with private sector and the international climate negotiations through litigation and through the three scenarios that we have highlighted. So in conclusion, when we started the book, we were thinking actually of 6 scenarios that can be brought down to these 3 that I just highlighted. And what Makan and I have done in the book, we have considered a scenario-based methodology, both for the book and for what comes afterwards, which is the Climate Change Litigation Initiative. And I'll expand on this methodology in just a second. So now we have explained that this is about climate change. This is about litigation. I'll tell you a little bit more about the book. As I said, the most important thing, in my opinion, is that it goes beyond the usual suspects. In the world map here, you have all the countries that are included in C2LI. Most of them are also included in the book. There's probably just Uruguay and Namibia and a few others that are not involved in the book, but most of them are from all parts of the world. Similar list of countries here. On the left, you have those that come from Africa, Latin America, Asia, and on the right, Europe, North America, Oceania. But even on the right column, which to some extent you could consider, well, these are the usual suspects, the USA. There are some countries there that had some litigation in the past, but also countries like the Czech Republic, or Russia, or Ukraine, Slovenia. Spain has just had its first case, but these countries have little or no climate change litigation, even within those countries that you would consider may have it already. So really what this book does, and it's not the only one. When it started, maybe there were a few, but now I'm aware there are at least 2 or 3 other books that are coming out, which also have a much wider coverage, if you want. We are looking beyond the usual suspects. Now, I wasn't alone in this journey. The person who actually kickstarted everything, who is Professor Makan Moïse Benguet at the University of Geneva Faculty of Law. And Makan is a dear friend, a dear colleague. And Makan invited me back in 2017, so 4 years ago, to join him as General Rapporteur for the International Academy of Comparative Law in their biannual effort in identifying topics and then mapping, if you want, the scenario around, the scene around the world. And we were given climate change and the individual, but from the start, Makan and I decided that it would focus on litigation, and it would focus in a way that was also practical, and not just an academic book. Very soon, we were joined by a huge amount of collaborators. Almost all of them you find on this slide. As Kate said, we had 42 national rapporteurs for 28, 29 countries. C2LI actually were 32 countries. And I want to spend some time thanking every one and each one of them. I know a lot of them are actually with us today in the, as a participant to this webinar, because the amount of time, the generosity, the collegiality that has been created over the years through our engagement with the national rapporteurs has been something really absolutely fantastic. And it's no surprise that we continue collaborating and working with so many of them with C2LI. So what did we ask all of these colleagues? Well, we asked them to go back to their own country, consider the legal landscape, the judicial landscape, and tell us in their first national report, then book chapter, whether the 3 scenarios actually took place. Did that scenario happen in Qatar? Did it happen in Russia? Did it happen in the Czech Republic? Did it happen in Colombia? And so forth. And to take us through any case law, obviously, that may have happened that fell into that scenario. But also, importantly, if that country had no climate change litigation or very little climate change litigation, Why was that the case? Were there any political, but maybe also legal and other kind of challenges that prevented climate change litigation from occurring? Or maybe other reasons, which I will highlight in just a second. So obviously, the amount of work and the amount of content that we got into the book was incredibly rich. I do not have time to go through it, and I do not intend to do that, but I do intend in the next slides to give you some highlights. The first one is about the different and ever-increasing list of grounds of review that litigants, that individuals and plaintiffs are using to win, to be successful in climate change litigation cases. Now, starting with the first scenario, the public climate policy litigation, you have breach of international law obligations that when they refer back to the Paris Agreement itself, human rights, which has been ever increasing in the last few years. In the latest LSE Sabin policy report on trends in climate litigation, human rights is highlighted as one of the main trends over the past year, which we have definitely seen also in the book. Tort law, which was used also in the famous Urgenda case, public trust doctrine and those jurisdictions that accept and welcome the public trust doctrine, and breach of other environmental obligations. When it comes to the public project-based climate litigation, those that in a way scrutinize the authorization of a specific project, we have very similar grounds of review. But obviously we also have the judicial review, in some countries called the administrative review, which clearly, for obvious reasons, since it's always often it's authorized by an administrative authority, plays a very big role. Now, when it comes to private climate litigation, we have a number of interesting developments, again, also highlighted by the LSE Sabin policy report recently. And it's that you really start having a lot of creative arguments to bring litigation against the carbon majors, or generally speaking, the private sector. So in addition to the ones I've already mentioned, you have criminal law grounds sometimes, anti-competitive grounds, issues of fiduciary duties, and breach of international, national, and corporate guidelines. Often cases are even brought before the OECD, for example, contact points. So there's a very rich plethora of legal arguments, legal grounds that you can find in the book. The book also touches upon cross-cutting matters, and very importantly, especially for the countries with little or no climate litigation, the challenges ahead. So very briefly, just in terms of cross-cutting matters, causation has always been a stumbling block, a problem, a challenge, if you want. Less so to some extent after the famous carbon major study, especially for private climate liability. But still, it is something that is daunting for many plaintiffs. How am I going to prove the causation of emissions here and the effects there, and so forth? The role of science, in many cases, in many countries that we have covered, the role of science is becoming more and more important. The scientific findings, the role of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the role of scientific evidence, scientific experts before these cases is becoming more and more dominant. A further cross-cutting matter is the issue of separation of powers. Depending on the jurisdiction that is covered by the chapter in the country included in the book, you will have countries where the judiciary doesn't feel very comfortable, let's say, exercising any scrutiny towards the executive branch of the government, let's say. And we have seen that in recent cases as well, even here in Europe. In other parts of the world, in other countries, the judiciary feels very much at ease scrutinizing climate policy from the government, and sometimes goes even as far as suggesting ways forward in terms of policy. So that was very interesting to explore in the different countries and the different chapters. Now, in terms of challenges ahead, access to justice is a big one. And access to justice can be seen in many different ways, but it's also about money, as simple as that. There are many countries, including in the UK, where access to justice is not accessible, if you pardon that word. I mean, it's a very big issue. And it can be really the reason why you cannot consider even bringing litigation. Lack of capacity, definitely in some countries, not just for the plaintiffs, but sometimes also for the judiciary itself. And I'm fully aware that there are a lot of very exciting and interesting programs aimed at bridging that capacity gap. Legal culture. Here I do want to say a few words, because not always the lack of climate litigation in a country is because you have the other problems, the access of justice in terms of financial problems or lack of capacity. There may well be very good capacity. There may even be good climate awareness, which I'll get into in just a second. It's just that in specific countries and specific jurisdictions, the courts and litigation is not the first port of call, to put it like that. And disputes of this nature as well are resolved in different ways. Now, in some of these countries, things are changing and you start seeing also using the courts, but we don't have to immediately say, ooh, if there's no litigation, there is a problem. No, absolutely. And I'll highlight at the end of the talk what C2LI, let's say, our ethos towards litigation, but I think you start getting a sense towards it. And in some countries, there's still a lack of climate awareness. Now, for those of us who work on climate change, we always, and I'm the first one to be guilty, we always think, oh, well, come on, we have heard about climate change since 1992. People are aware, people know about it. But that's not the case. That's not the case still. Just yesterday, I was in a very interesting talk with colleagues from other countries that are really invested in promoting climate change awareness, education. I myself work with primary schools, with the wider education sector to bring more awareness about climate change and sustainability. So when you don't have climate awareness, well, more likely you will not have climate change litigation. Now, that was the book. I want to spend a little bit of time now telling you what came after the book, which is where we are now. And let me clarify once again. When we started the book, we always had this in mind. We always wanted the book not just to stay on a shelf, not just to be used by other researchers, but to actually have a life after the book. And this is what the Climate Change Litigation Initiative is all about. So Makan and myself have been joined in this effort by Professor Jolene Lin at the Asia Pacific Center for Environmental Law at the National University of Singapore. And together with Jolene and Makan, I'm very, very happy to be the director of C2LI. It's been a long journey, as you can see. We started back in 2017 when we launched the book project. The book project was then presented in Fukuoka at the biannual International Academy of Comparative Law Conference. The book is now in our hands, or at least in Kate's hands. We want to launch C2LI at COP26. So there is an appointment, save the date, in November 2021, hopefully. But C2LI doesn't finish there. C2LI will continue. And we are already planning in 2022 to review country reports that we have now and to add more countries. So we would love to hear from you in the chat, via email, in whatever way you want. If you feel that you have something to collaborate with us, we definitely want to include more countries. So let me take you through what we want to do with C2LI. For every single country included in C2LI, which you can see in the map here, we want to stick to the scenario methodology if you want. We want to stick to the 3 scenarios: public climate policy litigation, public project-based climate litigation, and private climate litigation. And for each one, we want to provide information about standing related matters, grounds related matters, and remedies related matters. In a way, the 3 phases of a dispute. You get before the court, you have standing, you then litigate your case based on a number of grounds, and you seek some sort of remedy from the case itself. C2LI, however, because we do focus also on countries without any climate litigation or with very little climate litigation, in exploring standing grounds and remedies related to the three scenarios, will also highlight non-climate areas case law that may be relevant for future cases. So there may be cases from other areas of law, commercial law, or whatever other area of law, that could be used by judges to determine one of these three scenarios. And also, to the extent possible, highlight challenges and barriers to climate litigation in that specific country. So once this becomes a virtual platform, a website with a searchable engine, what the user would do, they can click on a specific country, click on a specific scenario, click also if they want on either standing grounds and remedies, and they would accrue that specific information. Now, how are we going from the book to this virtual platform, to a web page with a searchable engine, and focusing on standing grounds and remedies? Well, it is a complicated process with a lot of people involved. And we really want to, we have developed a very rigorous, I call it peer review process, but it's not peer review in the sense of academic. It's peer review just to keep us on our toes and be sure that we update and fine-tune the information, because obviously this is a very fast-moving topic. So the chapter or the report will be worked upon by legal analysts, research assistants, and national rapporteurs together in order to translate it, if you want to call it like that, or just bring it down, summarize it, make it smaller, and in a language that is more accessible. And then we will also collaborate with a lawyer, with a professional practitioner from that specific country. And that person will keep us again on our toes when it comes to standing grounds remedies from the specific jurisdiction that we are involved. We are putting together a C2LI focus group, which will be asked in due course to review how this web page searchable engine device, if you want to call it like that, will operate for 8 countries. We will ask them for constructive comments and feedback, and based on that, we will adjust the portal, the web page, to include the other 22, 23 countries. And we aim to have an advisory board that throughout the life and the duration of C2LI will provide similar constructive comments and feedback. So who do we want in this C2LI users focus group? Well, we want the kind of people that we believe will be interested in this web page, in this search engine. And these could be judges, these could be researchers, these could be lawyers, people involved in the cases itself, or that may wish to be involved in future cases, but also media who is interested in climate change, who follows these kind of matters, and potentially also others that may have an interest in this area. And again, we are very interested in having in the focus group users from countries with little or no climate litigation. So if you happen to find yourself in one of these categories and you are participating to this webinar, please do drop in the chat if you are interested in maybe being part of this focus group, and we can then reach out explaining what it will mean in terms of workload, in terms of commitment, time commitment. We're all very busy. I can anticipate that it won't be a huge time commitment, and we will not be asking too much from you. But the focus group will be incredibly important, and we really want to work as well as possible with them. Moving on, we are working with C2LI Legal Analyst, and I do want to spend a little bit of time on this because this has been and is currently being an extremely rewarding and fantastic experience. So we have Amelia Burnett and Kate McKenzie. Kate, you have already met, both PhD researchers at the University of Strathclyde. You have Gaston Medici Colombo and Lennart Wegener at Rovira Virgili University in Tarragona, Spain, and the University of Göttingen. And Gaston and Leonard have previously been visiting researchers at the center here at Strathclyde. We have Lydia Omuko-Jung, who is from the University of Graz. And Lydia is an alumni of Strathclyde, and she will soon, once all this COVID craziness finishes, she will soon join us, also as a SCELG visiting researchers. And the last but not least, two members of the current C2LI Legal Analyst are Esmeralda Colombo from the University of Bergen in Norway, and Pau de Vilches Moragas from the University of the Balearic Islands, who has just recently completed a PhD precisely in climate change litigation. I work very closely with the C2LI Legal Analyst. They are a fantastic team, and it's really proved to be what I was hoping from the beginning, that the book and the initiative would really lead to a community. And it's one of the things that I'm very, very proud of and very happy of. But there are more people. We have C2LI research assistants. We have Humsa, we have Iona, we have Haley Bow, we have Catherine. All of them were part of last year's cohort of the Strathclyde LLM in Global Environmental Law and Governance. And we also had research assistants from the Asia Pacific Center for Environmental Law at the National University of Singapore. Now, in this very rigorous peer review process, the role of the research assistants cannot be underestimated. They work a lot, but they also get a lot. They got a lot in terms of networking, and they get a lot in terms of knowledge from the work of the national rapporteurs and so forth. We definitely want to and need to work with more research assistants. Some will come from this year's cohort, obviously here at our own LLM, but there is space and there is interest in collaborating with other students who, again, may be on the webinar right now, or who may be known by colleagues in academia that are part of the webinar or just in our network. So again, please feel free to use the chat in case you're interested in joining us, or reach out to us in any other way. So C2LI will be launched at COP26 on the 6th of November, Saturday the 6th of November, in collaboration with the LSE. We are organizing a high-level event on climate change litigation at the Technology and Innovation Center, which is the building you can see in the bottom. And at that event, we will be officially launching C2LI and opening the platform, the virtual platform, the web page. So I really hope that some of you can even be there in person, all going well, and I really look forward to that launch. However, we have not stood still between now and COP26. We have done things as C2LI. And the two things I want to mention are first the webinars, our series of webinars. The first one we had took place in November in collaboration with the LSE, and it was about climate change litigation in Brazil. It proved very popular. The speakers were just absolutely amazing. And it really shed some interesting light on the developments that are happening in Brazil when it comes to climate change litigation. Our national rapporteur, Patricia Klein Vega, was there as well, and we continue collaborating with her. We are planning future webinars focused on the three scenarios. So the first webinars on scenario 1 will be in Spanish, because Spanish and English are the two official languages of C2LI. Again, the idea of going beyond the usual common language that is English, but expanding into other languages, for the time being just Spanish, but hopefully we can also expand to other languages, which are just as important as English. So the first webinar in Spanish will be with the Universidad Externado de Colombia on the 28th of April. And the second one will be with the University of Chile in June. Focusing on scenario 2, we'll be organizing a webinar in September. And focusing on scenario 3, private climate liability, we'll be collaborating with the National University of Singapore, and that will be in October, just before COP26. We also have C2LI interviews. These are 3-minute, short and snappy, conversations that we have with our national rapporteurs, with the colleagues who have helped us throughout this journey. Some are in Spanish again, but you can see you can see the list of countries that have already been covered, and more will come very soon. So we started, just Makan and I. Jolene joined during the process. We are still collaborating with most and many of our fantastic national rapporteurs from all parts of the world. We have an amazing team of legal analysts. We have research assistants that have proved invaluable. What this means is that C2LI has become a really, really big team. 3 directors, 7 legal analysts, around 40 national rapporteurs, 42, Kate says, 6 student research assistants, 5 practitioner assistants. These would be the lawyers that are helping us, and more are joining. We have, obviously, very importantly, a web page developer that will work on the virtual platform and the searchable engine. And we have 2 supporters, 2 organizations that are supporting us, especially when it comes to the web page developer. And I do want to take a second to thank Rouse LLP and Clyde & Co., 2 law firms that have agreed to generously support C2LI in its launch and in the development of the portal. And I'm very, very grateful to both of them. I am concluding now. When we started C2LI, I mentioned this a number of times, but I really want to highlight it again. We didn't want this book just to end up in a shelf and be forgotten, or be used only by a set of users, that mainly being researchers in academia. There are way too many books like that. We wanted the book to have some sort, even very small, but some sort of practical input in the huge fight that we are all involved in against climate change and moving towards a 1.5 degrees world. So C2LI is that effort. But it's also important to say what C2LI is not. C2LI is not a database of climate cases. And importantly, it's also not an initiative for climate change litigation. It's an initiative about climate litigation. We are neutral when it comes to climate litigation. We believe climate litigation is part of a huge puzzle of efforts, policy, legal, normative, and socioeconomic efforts to deal with climate change. Climate change is so complex that it cannot be dealt with just by one thing, just by litigation. But at the same time, we are aware that litigation is increasing, that litigation is proving successful to some extent in some cases, and maybe in the Q&A we can define what do we mean by successful. So that's where we are. It's an initiative about climate litigation, and it is an initiative open to more people who want to join. So again, please tell us in the chat, please tell us by contacting us whether you want to join us. And last thing, while we are not a database of climate litigation and we are not an initiative for climate litigation, obviously we are aware of initiatives in that sense. And I'm very happy to say that we are already collaborating, and in some cases we collaborated almost from day one, with, for example, the LSE and their amazing database in collaboration with Sabin Center at Columbia. We are very much in close contact and keen to collaborate even more with the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law and their efforts on climate change litigation. But there's so many other partners that could and will be working with us or us with them. And again, I strongly encourage you, again, if you happen to be one of those in the webinar, to let us know in the chat or to reach out in whatever way you consider more appropriate. So I stop there, Kate. In this slide, you have my email. You have our Twitter handles, both for the Center, for C2LI Initiative, and I look forward to being in touch with as many of you as possible.
Thank you so much, Francesco. It was a very thorough presentation, and I very much appreciated reminiscing a bit To all of the attendees, we are aware of some issues with the chat and also with some sound. We have worked through most of those, I think. If anyone else has issues with hearing us, well, then you won't be able to hear me, but hopefully you will be able to see the recording, and I have been answering some of those questions as they've come in. Now, Francesco, we have received quite a few questions. So we'll jump right in with those. The first set of questions, it's actually two questions that we have received from Salvatore De Rosa, and those are, first, how important are NGOs and the social climate movements in initiating and driving climate litigation in the various countries? Particularly, he's wondering if that makes a difference in climate litigation when active civil society makes it an issue of public concern beyond the court, and how do we see that in what we've found so far?
So thanks to Salvatore, and I'm really sorry if the sound wasn't perfect. Definitely, NGOs and civil society, social, climate movements are playing a very, very important role, and are to some extent the driving force of the climate litigation agenda, if you want. I think they also have another important role, which is about the effects of a litigation. So I was hinting to the idea of is a case successful or not. You can take a very narrow approach, which is you look at what you're asking the court, and if the court says yes, then it's successful. But I think we need to be a bit more broader than that. And a case itself can raise a lot of awareness. But if there's nobody to then push that awareness, if there's no organization to really multiply that awareness, then again, you have a problem. And I think that's where civil society, that's where NGOs also play a role. So it's not just about bringing cases, it's about the narrative around those cases, which NGOs and climate movements have a very important role in.
Thank you. The second question from Salvatore is regarding science, and particularly weather science. So his question there is, do the results of the book show a particular relevance of evidence provided by weather attribution science? So the attribution of extreme events to climate litigation in any specific litigation.
So the way I would answer to that is that this is often a question which is asked by countries that are suffering disproportionate climate change effects. Think of the devastation from typhoons in the South Pacific or the Philippines and so forth. And they argue that those extreme weather situations are caused by climate change, which is coming from other parts of the world, let's say. And when it comes to that, there's a question of cumulative effects of climate change. And causation is helping a little bit there. We are getting somewhat closer to that aggregation of cumulative effects, and hence being able to say that what happens there causes that harm there. But it's still a very, very big hurdle. And that's potentially one of the reasons why, for example, international climate litigation is still very much in its infancy, if you want, and very complicated. But when it comes to domestic climate litigation, I do think where we are is that there seems to be very little doubts that climate change is real, that climate change is anthropocentric, if you want. The extent to which these extreme weather, events are brought into cases at the domestic level are, at least in my opinion, slightly less dominant. And it's more a question when it's, say, more of a country trying to sue either another country or bring in this more international dimension, which I see another question about that as well.
Yeah, we have actually, so the next two questions are both about international level instruments and also international litigation. The first is from Adaku Ichechi Amadi, asking if there is any current regulatory framework for climate litigation at the international, or if we have to just rely on international instruments to govern climate. And then Specifically regarding international litigation, Stacy Alvarez de la Campa asks, what steps can small island developing states take who are disproportionately affected by the effects of climate change to gain standing in international litigation?
Mm-hmm. So obviously very big questions. The first one, if the question, if I interpret the questions as, is there, official guidelines, if you want, at an international level for countries to bring litigation, then I would say that's not the case. But at the same time, if the question is, are there some steps at domestic level to bring these cases that can be replicated and so forth? Again, I think one of the things that comes out from the book, and I feel very strongly about this, is that while we may find some trends, while we may find some common characteristics, every single country has a story to tell. And that, I think, is what the richness also of the book and similar books that are coming out very soon, let's say, provides. Now, moving to Stacy's comment about, in particular, SIDS, Small Island Developing States and International Litigation, efforts were made back in the past by Palau and so forth to trigger, in particular, the International Court of Justice system. And similar efforts are actually being campaigned as we speak by our renewed interest by youngsters that started in the Pacific Island Students Campaign for Climate Change. And now this has been expanded to a global youth movement. And what they are trying to do is to bring the attention of climate change to the General Assembly so that a resolution can be brought whereby a request for an advisory opinion, so not confrontational state to state, but an advisory opinion is hence requested by the General Assembly to the ICJ. Time will tell whether this will happen, whether it will be successful, but it's definitely something that at least civil society, very much starting from SIDS, is pushing very, very strongly. But I think there's another point, and I mean, this is an area also for Kate and other colleagues within the center, is that if we're talking about international climate litigation, which I need to clarify is not included in the book was about domestic climate litigation. Which courts are we talking about? Which areas of law? Is there any potential to bring in the ocean climate change nexus, which is an area that Kate works a lot in? Are we talking about the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, where other colleagues at the center have worked and so forth? Or are we talking about moving to a completely other dimension, which is international investment law and international trade law? So it's almost like a menu. You can choose the recipe and where to go, but it is a very complicated picture.
Thank you, Francesco. We have the next question comes from Malcolm Combe here at Strathclyde, and he says he appreciates it is impossible to cover everything, of course. But in your view, are there any jurisdictions that you wanted to cover but were unable to? He's particularly interested in Australia.
So first of all, I'm delighted that Malcolm and other colleagues from the law school are here with us today. Australia, we tried. We tried reaching out to a number of colleagues, but for a number of reasons, it didn't work out. The reason why at some point we just said, look, the book is big enough. We can, not have Australia in this book, is that our main interest was to go precisely beyond the usual suspects. For anybody working on climate change litigation, the literature on Australia, especially on scenario 2 in particular, and nowadays on scenario 3, is huge. There are so many authors, excellent colleagues around the world and in Australia who have covered Australian case law on climate change litigation. So because of the focus beyond the usual suspects of the book, at some point we were somewhat disappointed, but we could live with it, let's say. Now, in terms of other countries, obviously, in an ideal world, we would have all of them, and who knows, maybe at some point in the next decade, we'll get to all the countries of the world. But I'm personally curious, for example, countries like Japan, countries like South Korea, where I do know that climate change litigation has started. Countries like Bangladesh, which I am delighted to inform that we already have a colleague who wants to join us representing and being national rapporteur of Bangladesh. More countries in Africa, French-speaking Africa. So, one could say the sky is the limit, but no, the number of countries is the limit. And we definitely want to go in that direction. I think the challenge will be, and again, maybe going towards Stacey's points and other points, when it comes to the SIDS and countries that, in a way, have really contributed the least to climate change, and we have some countries like Bolivia that you could say fall into that category. What is the role of domestic climate litigation in that country? Because civil society in those countries may well look outside their jurisdiction. They won't be so, let's say, interested in going in challenging their own government or companies that are operating within their own territory that are from that country, but they may be interested in other parts of the world.
Thank you for that. Next, we have a couple of questions from Matteo Famiglia. And the first one is, would it be worth considering climate-related cases before international investment tribunals within C2LI, although not strictly falling under the label of climate litigation per our own taxonomy? They do nevertheless entail some scrutiny of domestic measures from the perspective of private investors.
So in a way, I think this has been somewhat already covered, but thanks to Matteo for his question and for his nice comments. At some point with Makan and later with Kate and the other people, we had to put some boundaries. Already the book is quite big, but we had to put some boundaries, and one of the boundaries was not to focus on international litigation. I'm the first one to agree with you, Matteo, that all these areas, which to be honest, I am somewhat more familiar with as an international lawyer myself and having worked on international trade law, being involved in international dispute settlement, I would have felt more comfortable. So I myself went into a less comfortable area for myself, but that was the decision we made. Whether we can have a C2LI just for international litigation, not now. Maybe it's something that other people can take on board or may want to collaborate with us. But I think now we're focused more on the national side, let's say. But I'm fully aware, and I agree with you that again, it's a big puzzle, and even litigation is not just domestic. It's international, it's transnational. So there are a lot of areas that need to be explored, both in research and in practice.
And to that same point, Matteo's second question is regarding whether the EU as an entity rather than the individual countries within the EU are included in the material scope of the analysis. And if not, would we consider including them in the future?
Yeah, I mean, this is a good point from Matteo. And I have to say that while we didn't think of the EU at the beginning, I remember at one of our annual SKELG PhD colloquiums, we had a colleague from Denmark who presented precisely on the European Court of Justice, ECJ, and climate change litigation. And I did feel that maybe we were missing out by not including the EU. No time to expand on what the EU is, what it isn't, and so forth. But in a way, you could consider that the state members operate in a way where the ECJ is used to scrutinize their actions and so forth, a bit like what you would do at the national level. So I think it's worth thinking about it, and maybe even with you, Matteo, we can have a one-to-one conversation on whether this is something that we may want to take forward. And obviously, there have been some cases that have been brought even at the European level that have a very high profile, let's say.
Finally, we have a question from Linnea Nordlander. She's curious to hear your thoughts about what are the potential of climate litigation in achieving the climate goals when judgments are not implemented, or inadequately implemented, and how impactful is a positive judgment on its own?
So thank you, Linnea, for this question. I think it's something that deserves a lot of attention, and I know that colleagues like Joanna Setzer at LSE and others are looking into. And I think it goes really back to effectiveness of what makes a case successful and what role has litigation in all of this. And I think one has to unpack to some extent your question. So you ask, I'm just going back to it. So, whoops, okay, so in achieving climate goals, so what do you mean by climate goals? If climate goals is reaching 1.5% globally, well, not all the climate cases in the world together, even if they're implemented in the next 5 years, will reach that. If we are saying climate goals as pushing towards that, then we're starting to see a different picture. If by climate goal, we are saying changing the narrative, changing the discourse within civil society in a specific country that was not, for whatever reason, particularly keen on fighting climate change, then we may have a different answer. Then even a case that has formally been unsuccessful, meaning that the judges did not provide the remedy that you asked for, may be successful if it ignites a discussion about climate change, which leads in the next general elections to have a more climate-friendly political agenda and more stringent targets in the next NDC, whenever that may be. So I think it's a very complicated thing to answer with just one criteria. You probably need multiple criteria, and these criteria may change from country to country. And I do think that the kind of question Linnea asked is one, and I'm aware that it's being done by some, but probably more needs to be done at an empirical level, be it in research, but that has a huge practical aspect, which I think is very, very interesting. So yeah, I can't answer in one way, but hopefully I gave some parameters there.
Thank you, Francesco. And we do have a few more questions coming in, but I'm mindful that we are almost at the end of our time. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Please do feel free to reach out to us either via the SCELG website or C2LI. We have a C2LI email address in there as well. If you are interested in collaborating, please do let us know. We will be going through the chat to see all the various interests that has been noted. And I apologize again for the technical issues that we were having. But I wanted to just see if Francesco had any closing thoughts before we end today.
No, just again, a huge thanks to Kate for chairing the webinar. Big apologies to anyone who couldn't hear me or who didn't hear me perfectly. Hopefully in the recording, all this will be solved and you can hear me again if you really want to do that. And just to finish up saying that C2LI is a living project, is a project that has grown already, and there is scope for it to grow even more. We are actively seeking collaborators. We're actively seeking also other organizations that may be in a position to support us, obviously. And I really, really look forward to reading the chat. As you can imagine, I did not read the chat because I was talking. So I am very interested in reading the chat, in answering to any questions that may have been posed and that did not have the chance to answer, and hopefully to expand the C2LI community even more than what it already is. So that's all from me, and I hope if you do get the chance to lay your hands on the book that you enjoy it, and in November 2021, I hope you can join us for the launch of C2LI. Thank you very much, Kate.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.